So we are going to talk about snails. Snails are super interesting. They are so weird. Let me just say that off the bat. They're so cool. There's lots of different things about them that we're going to talk about. I'm primarily going to talk about a land snail and a little bit about a sea snail because they're a little bit different and that's kind of cool. Now, they are all they're all gastropods, which means they're either a slug or a snail. A snail has a shell and a slug doesn't. So that's pretty easy. Now, some people think if you take a snail shell off of a snail, it will just turn into a slug. This is unfortunately not the case. The snail's shell, well, that was hard to say, has a lot of stuff in it, and I'll show you a picture of that later of all the good things. But the shell is basically like the exoskeleton of the snail. Oh, I'm gonna have to say that a whole lot. So they need to have those to live. Now, snails live all over the world, which is pretty interesting. They live on land, in freshwater, and in saltwater, and they're all a little bit different. We're going to talk later about a really special sea snail called an abalone that I met when I was in South Africa. Brag. Snails are really cool. They've been on the planet for about 500 million years, so forever these. Now, they are a mollusk, which means they don't have internal skeleton or bones. So they're pretty squishy, except for their shell, and that's where all their protection comes from. So there's a lot of different land snails. There are tons out there. I wrote somewhere, and I'll find it later, that there's a bazillion different types of snails. And by bazillion, I just found it, there are more than 60,000 types of snails. So instead of telling you about every single one, I'm just going to say, here's a snail we've probably seen before. Now, and I'll show you pictures of that as well. So the land snail I'm going to tell you about is called a grove snail or a brown-lipped snail. And those are the snails that have kind of a little circular pattern on their shells. When you see a picture, you'll go, I know that one. Basically, when you think of snail, you think of this guy. Now, they're from the UK, Ireland, and Europe, but they were actually brought over to North America by mistake, and they just live here because they're pretty good at living lots of places. If you have lived on Earth for 50 million years, you're pretty good at adapting to your environment. Now, some people wanted to know how fast snails are. Depending on the snail, because there's little snails and there's big snails, and they do lots of different stuff. But the land snail that are generally in our garden, land snails, they go about 0.5 to 0.8 inches per second. So they zoom, they're super fast. If they moved without stopping, they could go about 1 kilometer in a week. So like basically as fast as I can ride a bike. Now, a really neat thing about snails is they have the most amount of teeth in the animal kingdom, which is like crazy to think about because they're so little. Where do they put all those teeth? Well, their teeth is actually a really interesting feature about them is because in their jaw, they have this flexible band of microscopic teeth. So they're quite little and they're called radula. And what these little bands do is they rub against each other and they kind of just like rub the algae or the leaves or whatever they're eating. They just kind of like moosh it down in order to make like a smoothie basically, which is pretty cool. When their teeth break or fall out, then the ribbons just continue and they get more teeth that are there. So they always have lots of teeth. How many teeth do they have, do you ask? They have between 1,000 and 20,000 teeth in a snail, in that little tiny package. So it's pretty cool because they are microscopic and they are rubbing against each other. If you were to look at a snail, you wouldn't really see like teeth. If you look at a microscopic view of a snail's mouth, it's pretty gnarly. You look at it and you can see how they would break everything down. You can also, on YouTube, it's really interesting. If you look up, listen to a snail chewing, they have some really cool videos that you can hear snails chewing like really crispy lettuce and things like that, because you can hear the it's pretty neat. Apparently, if you put your ear very close to a snail, you can hear them chewing. I've never done this, but the internet tells me it's true. We always want to know about poo, so let me just get to that right now. Snails can't absorb color pigments, so if they eat cardboard or anything that has color in it, their feces will be colored. So they don't absorb it, but they have pretty colorful poo. So that's kind of a neat thing to, tell your parents for the next week and a half. Another really neat thing about snails, so they have all of these teeth. They only have 1 foot. And how that works is, if this is like a snail, so this is like what their face looks like, this is also what their foot looks like. So instead of having just like 1 foot that's dangling along, they just have like a muscle that pulls them along a surface, which is pretty cool. So instead of like, not like an inchworm that goes up, it's just sort of, it comes together. Oh my gosh, you made a little snail. That is excellent. A little orange snail. That looks great. And so it's pretty neat. They just they push themselves along with that 1 foot. And this is the same with sea snails and freshwater snails and land snails. They all have this like 1 foot that hangs out. And that's probably why they go pretty slow, because if you have 1 foot and you're dragging yourself along, it's a lot to do. Land snails only have 1 lung, which is pretty neat. And sea snails typically have gills. And so they breathe very differently depending on where they are. But all of them have, typically they have 2 eyes up here, and then they'll have noses down here. So when you look at a snail, you can see up here all these little guys moving around. They're kind of looking, but then they'll have tentacles down here that they're smelling, which is pretty neat. They don't, depending on the snail, some of them hear, but not through ears. They can kind of discern what's going on based on, feeling sound and movement in their bodies. But most of the time, they're doing lots and lots of smelling of the environment around them. Now, another thing that we all know about snails and slugs, because we see it a lot, is they have this sticky kind of like discharge behind them. They have like a carpet that shows you exactly where they were going. Oh, there's another snail. You are drawing so many snails. Good work. Now, this little discharge that they have protects them, and it's really interesting because they're dragging themselves along with 1 foot. And so the discharge that they have is really it's quite slimy, but it means that it reduces friction. They're able to go the 1 kilometer a week. But it also means if they're on something gravelly, they're not getting they're not dragging themselves on gravel. That wouldn't feel nice. It's also so slimy and viscous that if they were to drag themselves over top of a knife or a razor, they wouldn't get cut because they have all of this protection around them. Another orange snail. Oh, I wish that I had an orange snail to show you. Now, like I said, the shell of the snail is really important. So think about a sea turtle. They have to have their shells. Same with these little guys. So when they are born, they're born in eggs, but they actually have their shells already. It's not something that grows later. They are fully formed little snails. They just get bigger, bigger, bigger. Now the shell itself is made of basically calcium, and so it is their exoskeleton. It's they don't have bones inside; they have bones outside. Now you might have seen before a snail has gone up a door frame, or it's on a tree and it's just stuck there. You don't see the snail, but there's a bunch of dried out goo around it that's holding it there. This is called an epiphragm, which is a new word for me. So it's a temporary structure, and basically what they do is it's that dried goo, it's that mucus that they make. But if it gets too hot for them, if it gets too dry, because they're slimy creatures and need to stay slimy, they go, oh, uh-oh. And they make this epiphragm of this mucus. It is really, really strong, and so they're able to like stick on a tree or a door frame or things like that, and they just wait until it's warm or until it's not so warm, or it rains, or they're able to get a little bit more moisture. So it's pretty neat to think about. Now some snails do hibernate, but they do this really interesting thing so they hibernate in the winter, but if it gets too hot or it gets too dry in the summer, then they'll go into estivation. And so that is basically hibernation, but it's not that it's too cold, it's that it's too hot. So if they are in the desert, it's not going to rain for a while, they go, ooh, oh no. And what they do is they go completely into their shells, and they put that mucus on top of it, and they just have like a nap. They hibernate, but it's too hot for them, or it's too droughty. Sure. So it's just a little bit different from what we're used to in the northern hemisphere, where things hibernate because it's too cold. It's too hot for them, and they're like, no, we need to have our dew. Thank you very much. Now, another really cool thing about snails is they don't have a brain. They have ganglia, which is a group of neurons, and so they're able to think about things, but they're not able to, oh my gosh, Bert, that is an excellent snail. Whoa! Y'all know about snails. This is awesome. So they don't have a brain, so they can't think, oh, I shouldn't go over there, it's not nice. But they do have sensory, and they're able to kind of like go, ooh, this is good, this isn't good. So they're able to like eat a leaf and go, I am eating leaf. Or they're able to drag themselves across some gravel and go, ugh, this doesn't feel good, and they go to not gravel. So they can make, smaller decisions about things. They're not having like big snail conversations, but they are hanging out, which is pretty interesting to think. It doesn't have a brain, but it's still able to make like quite good choices. A really interesting American neuropsychologist won a Nobel Peace Prize, so like very fancy smart person, was looking at a sea slug, so very similar to snails, and they were looking at how the neurons worked, and they figured out in these sea slugs that they were able to learn. So they're able to say, you know what, I am not going to be uncomfortable anymore on this gravel. I'm going to go to grass, and it's going to feel nicer. And so it's not so much of a big decision they're making, but they are learning about their environment. So they're in cold water and they go, ooh, too cold, go to warm. Oh no, too hot, go to cold. And that's pretty cool. So this is the simplest animal, doesn't have a brain, so it's the simplest animal out there that can still learn things, which I think is great, because like we have brains, so we're able to learn a lot of stuff. Other interesting cool facts: the biggest snail in the whole world, giant African snails, they're around West Africa and Sierra Leone region. They can be from snout to tail 15 inches, which is 38 centimeters, or 1 kilogram, which is 2 pounds. What? So they are real big. Now, the largest sea snail is 90 centimeters or 35 inches, and the whole animal, including the shell, because the shell is part of the animal, weighs 18 kilograms or 40 pounds. It's huge. Things in the ocean can get real big. So like I said, the grove snail, or the brown lip snail that I'm going to show you pictures of, pretty interesting. They lay eggs like all snails do. Their clutches are about 30 to 50, so they'll have like 30 or 50 snail eggs, and it takes them about an amount of time. It takes about 20 days for snail eggs to hatch, which is pretty neat. And then they live about 8 years. And so they have that is literally dozens of kilometers that they have walked in that time. Like I said, some snails do hibernate in winter, but then it's really the dry and the hot times that they go into their shell and they go, ooh, no thank you. They have the dry mucus epiphragm that they'll just close it up, have a little sleep, do some hibernation, and then go out again, which is neat. Yeah, so like I said, the snails are born with their shells because it's part of their body, but they need to have more calcium when they're born. So when they're born, their shells will be transparent, and they actually eat the eggshell that they came out of, so they can get an immediate like bounce of calcium, so they can be really strong. So if you ever see a little tiny snail that has a clear shell, it means it's probably a baby, and it just needs a little bit more calcium to grow up, which is neat. So abalone. Those are sea snails that I'll show you some pictures of. They have some pretty long tentacles. They're also a primitive animal. They don't have a brain like the other snails that we talked about. They do have a heart. They have arteries and sinuses and veins. They're true animals. They have lots of different ways to figure out where they should go in the sea, if they're going to be more comfortable in this water or that water, and they're able to make those really yes or no decisions. This is cold here, hot here. Now the abalone has a really beautiful shell, but they can't go into their shell. Most sea snails can't go inside their shell like they would as a land snail. And so they are sort of closer to a sea turtle that they also don't go into their shell. So they have this beautiful shell on top, and they just kind of like drag themselves around with their one foot. But the shell is, you know, considered their exoskeleton. That is the thing that protects them. They're super, super strong. And what they do is they hang on to rocks and they just wait for like kelp and algae to drift by, and then they kind of just well, they it, which is pretty neat. They clamp down on the kelp and they use their radula, their band of thousands of teeth to chomp on it. So here are some pictures. So here is a snail I was talking about. This snail from the UK, Ireland, and Europe. So, but I think all of us have seen this snail before. So you can see its big old eyes on the top, and you can see that it is crossing the street right now. But its little tummy is, and its foot on the bottom is not getting scraped up because it has all of that mucousy sludge under it to help have a little less friction. And so this is the epiphragm. This is a snail. I kept on saying, if you see a snail in a doorway, because I have a picture of a snail in a doorway, but you can see how the epiphragm, the dried mucus, really holds it to the structure, and it really holds the moisture into the animal. So they don't get dried out, they don't get uncomfortable. They just wait until it gets a little bit more humid, and they can be on their way. Now these are abalone. This is an abalone farm in South Africa. Abalone is poached quite a lot in South Africa, and so they have farms to try to make sure that these animals don't become extinct, essentially. So you can see how different, this is still a snail, but you can see how different this snail is compared to this little guy. In its little circular shell. You can also see that it wouldn't be able to go into its shell at all because it's just on its back, kind of like a sea turtle. And so here you can see the differences that there's all these abalone. You can see its little tail, and you can just see all the ways that it understands the world a little bit differently than we do. But you can see both of these are snails, just a little bit different. And then here is a really good drawing, obviously, of what the inside of a snail shell looks like. And so it is really important, you know, they're not just slugs that have homes. Their shells are where so much stuff happens. It's where their lung is, heart, intestines, stomach, all these things. And so you can see there's quite a lot going in the shell. So if they get scared and they go into their shell, there's a lot of like maneuvering and kind of like and squishing that they have to do. But they've been on Earth for 500 million years. And so they're pretty good at adapting and knowing to have a big enough shell to fit everything in there. But I thought this was such a cool illustration because it just shows you all the things that are going on and just like a little tiny snail. Does anyone have any questions? Or are you just so amazed? The snails are crazy. 1 foot, 1 lung, no brain, thousands of teeth. Who knew all this was happening? Oh, cool. That is an excellent snail shell. Oh, that's a really big snail shell. Woo! Hope everyone can see those. Those are cool. And so the snail shell will grow with the snail. And so it's not like a hermit crab that will find another snail along the way. With their shells are really small when they are born, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger as the snail grows, which is pretty cool. So you think about those big shells that we just saw, they had to be really little when they were born, and then the snail grew all of that. So they really they have to have a lot of calcium so that just like us, so we can grow our bones, their shells. Are there any questions? Oh, Bert, you have a question.
Why are the eyes on the tentacles?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the eyes are there so they can move their tentacles around so they can look at things. So you think about our eyes, if we had to tuck into a shell, you know, our eyes would still be here, but they want to have some movement. So when they're tucking into a shell, when they're little, when they're getting big again, they can move around to see what's happening. And they're also able to look around, maybe not exactly behind them like that, but they're able to really understand the world around them. It's a good question.
It looks like Porrick has a question about if sea snails swim. Boy,
that is a good question, Porrick. Thank you. So they, just like land snails, they don't swim like a sea turtle. They have that 1 foot, and what they do is they clamp onto the rock, and if they do need to move, then they'll drag themselves along the rock. When they're little tiny babies, the eggs in the sea will disperse, but it's with tides and with the movement of the water. So they're not actually swimming. They don't propel themselves. They just use that 1 foot and just keep on moving.
Do all snails have a slimy tail?
Yes, yeah, all snails are slimy. And they're slimy because they do have to drag themselves around. So they want to make sure that they don't have any abrasions, so they don't get scraped up. Like, think about if we dragged ourselves on pavement, it would be very uncomfortable. So they make sure that they're slimy, so they're not uncomfortable. It just feels a lot nicer. It's good protection. So someone asked if salt was dangerous to snails, or how it's dangerous to snails. And it is dangerous because they absorb so much and they need to be slimy. And so what salt does is it dries things out. And so if they were to absorb too much salt, they would get too dry. And so so they absorb calcium through their skin, and they absorb tons of nutrients and lots of really great things for snails. But if they have too much salt, then they're not slimy, which they need to be. So sea snails that live in salt, they're able to, with their gills and with their body, they're able to filter out the salt. So they're specially adapted for that. But if you took a freshwater snail or a land snail and put it in salt water, it would not be very happy because they don't have the mechanism to filter, so we're looking for, to filter the salt out.
Do snails live in Antarctica?
Oh, good question. They do not, I believe. So there are some snails that live in really cold regions of the ocean, but Antarctica. So they blah blah blah. Here are words. So snails typically need to live on some type of substrate. So they can't just live on snow or live on ice. They need to live places that they're able to absorb calcium, absorb nutrients, and also find. Typically, they are vegetarian, but some are omnivores, and some are even carnivores. Or no, typically they're omnivores, some are vegetarian, sorry. And so Antarctica would be like a really hard place to live on the ice shelf because there isn't a lot of things for them to absorb or to eat. But there are some that live very north and very south in the ocean because they are able to find lots of things to eat in the ocean there. And they're specially designed to live in very cold water. Good question.
So I was wondering, when snails stick to door frames and stuff, how do they know when it's the right time to come out?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So okay, so they don't have brains, so they're not able to like knock on the door and say, "Is it raining? Is this good?" But they do have tons of sensory in their shell and you know in their body. So they're able to, like, when the temperature drops, they know that. So it's not them going, the temperature has dropped. They think that maybe I'll come out of my epiphragm and I will go somewhere else. They go, temperature's dropped, humidity up, walk. And so they're able to feel that in their shells. Their shells are not sensitive, but they're quite porous. And so they're able to know that the temperature's dropped and they know when it is humid outside or if it's raining. So it's just when the conditions get better, their non-brain, their ganglia goes comfortable. And when they go, oh, comfortable, time to get a move on.
Nora, last question is why do snails never go in straight lines?
You know, I think if you have one foot, very difficult to walk in a straight line. You're dragging yourself around. It's very hard. And you know, I think there's also something to be said about them. Typically, snails aren't going to a place. They're just living. And so a snail will like take a step, and it takes so long for snails to go anywhere. They take a step and their brain goes like, food? No. So they take another step, food? No. And so if they take a step at food, kind of, then they might go in sort of this direction. So they're never like commuting or going to work or anything like that. They don't have to go in a straight direction. They can kind of really understand the world around them a bit more, and they're able to, you know, just have their life not in a straight line. It's a good question though.